Hello, everyone. You're listening to For Those We Lost. I'm your host, Jennifer Sullivan. Thank you for being here. If you've lost a loved one to COVID and would like to share your story on the show, please send me an email. My email address is forthosewelostpodcast@gmail.com. Or you can go to the website forthosewelostpodcast.com and click on the contact button, and you can reach me that way as well. In this show, people share their stories of losing a loved one to COVID. Every story you hear in this show is full of heartbreak, grief, loss, and frustration, but they are also full of love and hope. We talk about how we are coping, we talk about how to keep the memory of our loved ones alive, and how isolating our grief is as the world wants to move on. You'll hear us talk a little bit about the vaccine and politics, and you may not agree, but I hope you'll keep listening because each person who shares their story on this show has experienced profound grief over the loss of a loved one. And that's something we will all experience. We all love someone, we will all lose someone we love, and we will all grieve. These are the stories of those we lost to COVID. Thanks for being here with me today. I've got a wonderful show coming up for you. Today, I'll be talking to Sara in Pennsylvania. I always learn something new from the guests on this show, and Sara is no different. She and her family have been navigating medical issues for years after exposure to H1N1. Because of this, Sara and her husband had their eye on the news when word of what we now call COVID-19 first started popping up in Wuhan, China. Sara and her family went on their own lockdown a few weeks before the United States. But she also acknowledged that with her family's immune-compromised status, she may lose people she loved. Her parents got COVID in November of 2020, and her father passed away on December 2nd. For context, we recorded this episode on December 27th, 2021. If there is one word I could use to describe Sara, it is storyteller. In this episode, she tells her dad's story and her family's story. She also has an exceptional grasp on complex medical issues. There are a lot of links to more information in the show notes below, specifically links to Right to Health Action, information on POTS syndrome, long COVID, the COVID cross-stitch memorial, the Yellow Heart Memorial, and Churg-Strauss syndrome. And with that, I'd like to welcome Sara to the show. Thank you so much for being here with me.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you reached out. And you and I talked on the phone, and I want to start with the health issues that your family has and how you first learned about COVID and why it was so important for you to know what was coming.
Yeah, so I actually had H1N1 back in 2011 when I gave birth to my youngest son. I was exposed, as was he. One of my other children actually was also exposed. And what happened was we have long-term health impact. So I went from having controlled asthma to needing medication and not having controlled asthma. My newborn was on constant nebulizers. And until he was able to go on some medication when he turned 2, it was nonstop asthma issues, sinusitis, and other issues. He still has sinus issues, um, and is now controlled by medication for his asthma. And then my daughter, who is my oldest daughter, she developed autonomic dysfunction from her H1N1, which a lot of people don't know much about, but it's very much like what long haulers are developing and from COVID. And I as well, it's only through my daughter's diagnosis I have realized all the medical problems that I have had over the years since I was a kid. um, Painted a picture as well, and I was diagnosed with POTS and autonomic dysfunction about a year ago. And so because of all of this, because we have such health impacts from past pandemics, because we are chronically ill, when I started hearing from my friend who lived in Wuhan about this virus going around, I got very nervous,
Yeah.
as you can imagine.
Mhm.
And I could see this was not something that was going to be little. And at the time I was running for office, this was back in December of 2019. And we had to ask the question, if this becomes a global pandemic, how do we run somebody who is chronically ill and has immunocompromised status? And it was a serious discussion we all started thinking about. I filed my taxes the day we could so that I could get my return and stock up on food and toilet paper because I saw this coming a mile away. And because of all of that, I started taking this much more seriously, much sooner than most. We closed our doors the first week in February, and we went under lockdown in our house, only doctors at that point. We tried to create telehealth appointments as much as we could already. We had reached out to our speech therapist and our OT, and we're like, how do we do this? Because we're closing our doors. So we had to renegotiate IEPs. And thankfully, our school was very, very understanding of our concerns. A week after we did that is when our county went on lockdown. So they actually used the language we wrote in their other IEPs. And because of that, we're ahead of the curve.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was scary because nobody was paying attention. And I started to get very concerned for my parents. My father was immunocompromised himself. Um, he had two forms of cancer that he beat. He had Church-Strauss vasculitis, which he was the first person in the world to go into remission.
Wow.
Yeah, the life expectancy is 5 years. He lived
Mm.
35 years with it.
Oh, wow.
So, and Dr. Fauci was a big part of that. So,
Mhm.
I worried about him. I worried about my mom, who every year gets pneumonia and has severe asthma. So, I looked at my husband when we closed our doors and I said to him very bluntly, who's going to be left at the end of this? Who are we going to be able to give a hug to when it's safe to once again? Who will still be here? And it was a scary question to ask.
Yeah. When was the last time you saw your parents?
So the last time, I am so grateful. My 40th birthday was September 2019, and I really wanted to do a campaign event back home in Chicago for my 40th birthday and use it as an excuse to, see everybody. And so, unfortunately, got very sick and ended up on IV nutrition, and we kept having to put it back. And so we went at the end of October of 2019 to Chicago to visit our family. And I am so grateful we did. My campaign manager and I were like, "How are we gonna do this? It's 2 weeks before election day." Not my election day, but a different election day. I need it to be seen everywhere. What are we gonna do? And I'm like,
Mhm.
"I've gotta go." I just had that gut feeling, and she respected that, and we made it happen. And my sister, thank God she did a photo shoot at the end of the
Oh.
campaign event. She happened to have a photographer who offered her a session, and she brought him, and we did all of my parents' grandchildren, so my children and my sister's child, all of us. We took pictures, just the 4 of us. We took pictures of my individual family with my parents. We did all of those family shoots for, like, over an hour, and my father, who hates getting, photographed, he actually was smiling and laughing in these pictures, and I have them now to thank. I'm
Mhm.
so grateful to it. On the face of my watch, I put the picture of all of us, which is the last picture we have of our entire family.
Yeah. Why don't you go into what happened with your dad? You live in Pennsylvania and they live in Chicago, so you didn't see them after October of 2019. So why don't you go into what happened with him?
Yeah, so my mom works housing the unhoused, and is she couldn't stop working. So she went into work every day, which scared the living daylights out of me. I was constantly begging her, "Can you just try working from home? Is there any way this could happen?" And there wasn't. And my sister is a caterer, so she had to pivot her entire business so that her employees would not lose their employment, and as a single mom, she wouldn't lose her income. And so she pivoted to feeding all the people who had lost their jobs, who had no food, who needed help. And so she had to work. She was feeding thousands and thousands of people. So I was scared. And the Sunday before Thanksgiving, my mom called. She would call every day on her way home from work. And I could hear she didn't sound good. She sounded sick. And because she gets pneumonia yearly, I can hear that starting. Um, and I could hear it, and I was like, "Mom, I think you have COVID." And she's like, "No, no, no, I'm just getting my normal winter crud." I'm like, "I think you have COVID." And I begged her to get tested and not to go to work the next day. And she called me the next day and was like, "I really don't feel good. I'm getting tested." And that scared the living daylights out of me because I was like, "Are you keeping dad safe?
Mhm.
Is dad okay?" And she's like, "It'll be okay. It'll be okay." And she agreed to go sleep in the basement. In They have a bed down there. And so she was quarantining, and the next day I was like, "You have to call the doctor. You sound worse. I'm so worried for you." And she made a comment to me. She's like, "Yeah, dad's out." Because I asked if I could talk to my dad, and she's like, "Dad's out." And I thought he was at a doctor's appointment,
Mm, mhm.
honestly. And I now know, no, he was out cold. He was sleeping in bed. And somehow I realized over conversations throughout the day that he wasn't feeling well. And I was like, "Mom, you have to mention this to the doctor. You have to mention this. Dad's really high risk." And she's like, "He doesn't want to call, blah, blah, blah." I'm like, "No, you have to tell Dr. Kenter." And so when Dr. Kenter called her, she mentioned it. And he's like, "Andy needs to get to the hospital immediately." And my mom's like, "He won't go. He wouldn't even call you."
Mhm.
And he's like,
Mm.
"You have 2 choices. This is what you're gonna tell him." She's like, "Okay." He goes to my mom, "Yeah, either he can go willingly and call 911 himself, or you can hit him over the head with a pan and call 911." So my mom went and gave him the choices, And he's like, "Fine, fine, fine. I'll go." And they called 911. He was struggling to breathe at that point, and he was already on oxygen, over a year before, about a year and a half before, he had a case of pneumonia that just really hit him because of the Turkish Strauss. He has lung damage. He was getting very special treatments for his lungs, so which kept them open on a daily basis.
Mhm.
So we were worried.
Yeah.
He got to the hospital. We were told he had 101 fever, 102, somewhere between those, and that he was in bad shape, and that's pretty much all I heard, and I was freaking out, and then I get a call later, "Oh, no, the fever isn't real, like, I'm fine. They're just gonna keep me for observation. I probably have pneumonia, but not COVID, not COVID." And I'm like, "Dad, when's the test getting back?" And he's like, "I don't know, I don't know." So, this was, around midnight-ish, the Tuesday before Monday or Wednesday before Thanksgiving, and we we always make Thanksgiving a really big deal. It was the one time a year my father, who was a chef in his early days, he would cook with us, and he had some trauma from his growing up, and that was the one time a year he would share stories about his family, and we would get to hear about his childhood. And so Thanksgiving has always had a very special place in our hearts. We would make ratatouille with him. I would peel garlic till like I was smelling like it for a week. And my sister would chop vegetables and we would all cook together. It was such a special thing. He would make his special mushroom soup. It was just really like a bonding time for us and him. And so this hit me harder than usual because it's like this is our time. And my father was sending me articles about like different treatments that are experimental. I'm like, "Can they get them for you, Dad? Can they?" He's like, "We don't know if I have COVID. It's probably the Turk Strauss. Don't worry so much, Sarah." I'm like, "Dad, like, really?" And we went back and forth. Um, Thanksgiving, he didn't sound good. He sounded like he definitely had pneumonia and he was not okay. At that point, he was in an isolation room, but not confirmed COVID. And we talked on and off, and it was nice. We talked about memories, about Thanksgiving. But he told me, "Sarah, don't worry, don't worry. Next year, we'll all be together and we'll have this massive Thanksgiving together and we'll do all our recipes and we'll all come together and it'll be so special. And we'll truly have something to be thankful for."
Mm.
And I'm like, "Okay, Dad." Okay. Trying to keep up you know. And then Friday, I was cooking Shabbat for Shabbat. I'm an Orthodox Jew, and I was on the phone with him. He got his positive COVID test back, and I was scared, and he was trying to, like, keep me peppy and, like, "It's okay, we're all okay,
Yeah.
and I'm gonna come out of this, I always beat everything," type of attitude, and I had a oven fire.
Oh.
I had my husband had put something in the oven, and there was plastic still on it,
Oh.
and thankfully, I was on the phone with my father. He talked me through how to deal with it because that's what he did.
Mhm.
And I was like, "Okay, I gotta go deal with it. I'll talk to you later." And that was the last time I heard him able to really talk. After that, it was very hard for him to speak. Breathing was just so difficult. I don't answer the phone on Shabbat because I'm off the grid completely from Friday night to Saturday night. But I told my parents that I'm keeping my cell phone in my bedroom, our house phone downstairs, and if something happens, let us know. We will answer the phone if we see it's you. And Saturday afternoon, I get a call. It was my mom. "I'm heading to the hospital. I don't feel okay. My O2 is getting too low." And that hit me like a ton of bricks. And I was like, "Okay, okay, we'll get through this. I'll talk to you right after Shabbos to check in with you." And the rest of Shabbos, I couldn't like think. I couldn't function. Like now both my parents are in the hospital with this. And as soon as Shabbat was over, I called and my mother was just being discharged. They said there was nothing they could do for her, and that she should call her doctor.
Oh,
Um, and they gave her a pulse oximeter.
wow.
And I freaked out. Like, she could barely talk. She was struggling to breathe. At that point, my sister was also sick with it, who lives with them. And I was scared out of my mind, if you can imagine.
Yeah.
I was calling her every couple hours to check on her. And my father was mostly texting, but mostly in emojis, because speaking was difficult. Brain functioning was probably hard at that point. Um, and I would try to call, but I wouldn't hear back from him, or I would hear from him that Sunday night. I called and he was so out of it. And he yelled at me. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He's like, "Why are you calling me at 4 a.m.?" And like, first of all, tone it down because you don't have the lung capacity to yell at me. Second of all, okay, daddy, go back to sleep because I didn't want to like start with him.
Yeah.
And he really thought it was 4 a.m. And that
Wow.
freaked me out. And I
Mhm.
called my mom crying, and she's like, "He's just not feeling well." Now I know he wasn't getting oxygen. He wasn't functioning. His brain was struggling because of the lack of oxygen. And that really scared me. And he called me back probably a half an hour later, and he was like, "How you doing today?" Like,
Oh,
that other call never happened, and I didn't
yeah.
want to start with him, so I just blew it off and didn't think about it. Like, yeah, I was thinking about it, but like I didn't want to bring it up.
Mhm.
And I let my mom know. And later that night, I guess he called her and he couldn't sleep that night. He felt so bad. He realized
Mhm.
what happened and he felt, I didn't want him to feel bad. And I told my mom, please tell him, don't feel bad. Like, it is what it is.
Yeah.
And she tried to keep him calm. I did too. And then the next morning, because we have the Monday after Thanksgiving off from school, I got a call from my mom. I was sleeping in. It was probably like 8 a.m. though that she called my time. She's like, "They want to vent dad today."
Mm.
And I was like, "Does he want that?" So I'm so blessed. My cousin is a chaplain, and her final paper, her thesis, was on making life decisions like this and letting your loved ones know ahead of time, making sure your family knows your wants and your wishes. And because of that, we had these conversations.
Mhm.
And I knew my father's wants. And so I questioned, is this what he wants? Because I didn't know. And my mom didn't know. And she's like, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if this would fall into the category he would want it. And so I asked, can we have a conversation with the doctors? And so the ICU doc, who happened to be a former pulmonologist of my father's, who he had fired, uh, and I have to say, as delirious as he was at times, boy, did he have words about that doctor. Um, and let all the nurses know. And so, additionally, his doctor, Dr. Kenter, who had saved him so many times before, he joined us in the conversation and we had a big conference, actual phone call, not on Zoom. And I asked Dr. Kenter, do you think this is what he wants? And Do you think he can get off of it? And Dr. Kenter has described this day, this conversation, as the worst day of his entire medical career. And he's getting up there. Um, and has had a long, amazing, difficult with patients like my father because he had to have these conversations before. So for him to say this was the most difficult is saying something. And he said, even if he beats COVID, and he could, he said he will never get off the machine
Mm.
because of the scarring from past, from the Strauss, from the other stuff. He will never be able to breathe on his own again.
Mm.
And I knew that's what he didn't want.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had to say the difficult thing, I don't think we should. And Dr. Kenter backed me up. He agreed. He didn't think my father would want this. My sister, this was hard to hear.
Mm-hmm.
My mother came around. My sister just kept telling him, be strong, fight this. You're a fighter. You beat everything, We need you at home. And because they were COVID positive already, they were allowed each 5 minutes with him. At that time, they weren't allowing people, but red strings were cut.
Mm-hmm.
And they quickly got over to the hospital. They they claimed they were going to do a FaceTime with me or a Zoom. That never happened. Um, every single time the hospital promised it, it never happened. So my mother snuck her phone in
Oh.
and gave me 1 minute of her time so that myself, my 5 children, my husband could tell him we loved him. And at that point, you know, that was hard, but it was also scary. I'm stuck here in Philly, and I asked my dad, should I get in the car? Should I come? He goes, don't you dare. Like it was the most clear thing he said that entire day.
Yeah.
Don't you dare. Keep my grandbaby safe. And because my daughter is immunocompromised, because of our past history, because of our asthma, because of all this complex medical stuff we deal with, he's like, don't you dare expose this child to that. Don't you expose yourself. Keep doing what you're doing. So, I was constantly calling my mom. At that point, they had moved him to the ICU. The next morning, we got a call. We're moving him back out of ICU.
Hmm.
I'm like, why?
Yeah.
You literally yesterday said he wouldn't make it through the day.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, he's perking up. He's doing so well. He's like, we've never seen this before. I'm like, uh-huh. Um,
Yeah.
it happened to be my parents' 42nd wedding anniversary
Mm.
that day. And so he was starting to respond to texts a little bit. My sister had found his hearing aids and gotten them back to him. She demanded his glasses be put back on so
Yeah.
he could actually see. And so they moved him down. And he texted everybody, things like, next year we'll celebrate 43 all together. He talked to my sister about the business stuff because he helped her with her business.
Mm-hmm.
He talked to my mom about whatever they talk about.
Yeah.
He answered texts, but I didn't hear from him. And my mom all day, he's doing so well. He sounds so good. I'm like, I haven't heard from him. What the hell? And she's like, he's doing so good. In the back of my head, I had read so many stories about the bounce back
Mm-hmm.
right before. And I kept trying to prepare everybody. I don't think this is what everybody thinks it is.
Yeah.
And they kept telling me to stop being a Debbie Downer,
Mhm.
but I was trying to mentally prepare myself
Yep.
because that scared me. And finally, he texted me back in the afternoon. And it was like not a, like just like hi, and an emoji. So I called. My mom kept saying, "Call, just call him." I'm like, "He's not taking my calls." And she's like, "Try again." So I called and he's like, "I'm really tired. I don't want to talk." I'm like, "Okay, I'll talk to you later. I love you." 10 minutes later, he had that habit.
Yeah.
He called me back and we talked for a long time. I would say it was over half an hour. And we just talked about the news because the two of us always talk politics together. Um, and I got to tell him that that day was the day that the UK approved the first vaccine.
Mhm.
And he was so excited, so excited. I got to tell him little things about post-election news. Um, I We had a good conversation, and he just asked me about silly stuff about the kids, like day to day, like how's school going
Mhm.
and what's their favorite game now and that kind of stuff. Like really just mundane stuff. And I got to make him laugh. So I got to tell him the mundane things about the kids. And my father, because of all his lung issues in the past, he had this laugh. When you made him laugh, his whole body laughed. But then he would start coughing.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
it was this deep bronchial cough. And you knew if you were really funny that he was really laughing, he would just start this deep bronchial cough that was just like, okay, okay, I'm sorry I made you laugh so hard. And I got to make him do that. And then I felt really bad after. I was like, oh no, I'm so sorry, Dad. And he's like, it's okay, Sarah. It's okay. And things wound down because he just wasn't feeling great at that point. And he's like, I'm tired. I need to sleep. I'm like, I love you so much. He's like, we'll talk tomorrow or maybe later tonight. I'm like, okay, Dad, I love you. I just want to say I love you. And at that point, I got to say it. I got to hear it. And I was happy about that. But I was scared. I mean, clearly he wasn't as healthy as they were claiming.
Mhm.
And I was scared. And I had to keep my face for my 5 kids. I had to keep calm.
Yeah.
So I put on some dumb show on the computer. I was cross stitching and I had the kids distracted with schoolwork. And, I was just trying to keep it together. My husband took over dinner that night because he could see I was not functioning.
Mhm.
And about an hour and a half later, my mom called and she's like, we're headed to the hospital. They just called. I'm like, okay, what's going on? Now, she had been begging them to let her see them. It was their anniversary.
Yeah.
And they said because he was in the step down ICU now, and because he was doing better, no.
Mm.
And I was like, what does that mean? She's like, it's time. So she got off the phone and they were racing to the hospital. I was my head's racing at that point. I'm falling apart. And I texted him. I told him, thank you for being such an amazing dad. I love you. And I know now that as I sent that text, as my mom and sister were pulling into the parking lot, he took his last breath alone, curled into the fetal position. And they allowed her to be with him for a little while after. So I'm grateful for that. But My sister, only one person could go up, and my sister had her daughter with her as well. So she was in the car in the parking lot and getting this news, and she calls me and she tells me, and I'm like, because the way she said it, I was confused,
Hmm.
literally confused. And I was like, it's gonna be okay. Dad pulls through everything. She's like, Sarah, do you not get it? He died. And I want to point something out right now. I just looked outside and it's snowing. And my dad and I had a very special connection with snow. Every time it snowed for the first time of the year, which I haven't seen snow this year, so this is the first snow I'm seeing. My dad and I would call each other because we loved snow. So I just want to point that out. It
Yeah.
just started snowing. Wow. Wow, that's intense. Okay.
Yeah.
Right as I said, my sister's like, no, Sarah. I saw it started snowing just now.
Wow.
So, wow, okay.
Yeah.
Um, so I tried to calm her down because she has her, at the time, 7-year-old in the car, and we just fall apart. And from there, we had to take care of the business of it.
Yeah.
My mom was still sick with it, and was still struggling. My sister still was feverish and couldn't smell, couldn't taste, and she's a chef, so that's
Yeah.
kind of important.
Yeah. For sure.
Thankfully, nobody in her kitchen got sick.
Oh, that's good.
But all of her employees, because of the strict guidelines she kept, stayed healthy. Um, Multiple people did pass from my mother's office, or their loved ones. Almost her entire office did get sick with COVID.
Wow.
So there was a huge impact from one person who made some bad choices.
Yeah.
And we will be forever changed because of it. But my father, that last phone conversation, he gave me marching orders.
Hmm.
Um, As I said, my father and I loved to talk politics together. We loved to really get down to it. We would argue, we would fight about it, we would agree but fight about it.
Yeah.
I had a habit where I would tell him, I didn't want to hear it. You're being an old man and I don't want to deal with your opinions anymore, and hang up on him. And then, 10 minutes later, he would call me back and be like, I'm sorry. Let me hear you out, even though we're saying the same thing.
Yeah.
And then we would find common ground and we would come back together. And he told me about how in the 90s, ACT UP, which was this organization of activists for HIV/AIDS. And I knew what ACT UP was, but he told me about how in the 90s they would take the ashes of their loved ones and put them on the White House lawn.
Huh.
And he said, politicize the F out of my death if I die of this.
Yeah. Wow.
He's like, take me to the steps of the White House and dump me there. And he gave me marching orders. He told me make sure no other families deal with this trauma.
Hmm.
And so as soon as I got up from Shiva, so in the Jewish tradition, we tear our clothing. We have the ceremony, we say the Kaddish, and we say a special prayer when we tear the clothing. And then we sit for 7 days called Shiva, where we mourn and people come to comfort the mourners and tell stories and share. I will say that having Shiva over Zoom, I am still traumatized going on Zoom every day, even though I use it for work every single day. That is not how you do Shiva.
No.
It is not comforting especially for somebody who gets ear migraines and that like the screen time plus, having buds in your ears for hours on end, it hurts. But as soon as I got up, the term we get up, we literally rise from Shiva. We stand up, we're sitting on the floor or on a short stool, and then we take a walk outside to rejoin the living. And so I got up, I took my walk around the block with my family, and I immediately contacted my friend who had reached out and said, "When you're ready, when you need a place to put your grief and anger, I've got a place for you." So as soon as I got up from Shiva, I sent that email, "I'm ready, marching
Yeah.
orders, what do we do?" And I had, I knew what I was supposed to do. I knew what my dad's legacy needed to be because he told me. And I got in the fight. And yeah, now it's time to fight for every other family so they don't experience this.
Yeah. Yeah, so you got involved with, an organization. Why don't you go ahead and tell us about that?
Yeah, so I contacted my friend Paul. He happens to be the policy director at Right to Health Action. And Right to Health came together right at the very beginning of the pandemic. Um, he and a few other people had put the word out who do work in global health. Paul is a veteran of ACT UP. He helped create the Global Fund for TB, malaria, and HIV. He helped get PEPFAR passed, which is funding for AIDS medicine and across Africa. And he he's a veteran bird dogger. Um, and I had met him through the healthcare fight and the ACA fight and some other fights, and he's like, "Okay." So Right to Health got together, the act up of COVID, and
Yeah.
they came together and they wrote this amazing called the 4P, the People's Pandemic Prevention Plan, and they spoke with public health officials, they spoke with others, and it was a plan of action how to not only stop this pandemic, but future pandemics from happening. And I had actually signed the 4P as an individual, another group that I was doing work for before all this. I'm still affiliated with them, Tora Trump's Hate. We signed the 4P. We were one of the first organizations to sign the 4P. There was over 141 signers of the 4P in Congress. Um, and, it, so we're fighting for vaccines around the world, global vaccines. We are fighting for a global fund for pandemic prevention that meets the WHO's health system standards for pandemic preparedness. We are fighting for healthcare and jobs for Indigenous communities that are actually funded. We are fighting for a New Deal size public health corps in the US to fight for racial health disparities. We're fighting for 1 million community health workers and forest defenders globally to fight for health and against climate change, and also to phase out US and EU sales by corporations that put the world at risk with irresponsible supply chains that include deforestation and wildlife trade. And we have worked on over 11 bills. We have passed the House with HR 391, which would fund our new global fund. We I have spent the last 6 months trying to get Senate Bill 2297 passed, which would vaccinate the world by mid to late 2022.
Mhm.
It would also fund the global fund. It would create health systems in play so that we can prevent the next pandemic, and contain it at the source, but also do prevention work so that by cooling down zoonotic transfer hotspots where these viruses are transferring from animals to humans, if we cool them down and we fight things like deforestation,
Hmm.
um, that can happen, which will help prevent the next pandemic from happening in the first place. For me, that is so important because one, I'm a survivor of one pandemic, and I have long haulers, and I mean, my own asthma has never been the same since then. And then I lost my father to COVID. So he told me, make sure no more families experience this trauma. So this work has been so healing. So what I do is I am the Pennsylvania state captain. So I organize all our member of Congress meetings. I meet with staffers to explain the legislation that we want passed and organize Pennsylvania for Right to Health. I'm also the outreach and engagement co-lead. So we work in all different ways. We make sure that the organization is diverse and is making sure that those most impacted lead. And also I work on the storytelling. So some of the team has dubbed me the storyteller.
Hmm.
And so I've done a number of trainings to help people create their story so that they can go to legislators and tell them, this is what happened to me. This is my family's story of either COVID lost or long haul or healthcare workers, and giving them the power to advocate in their loved one's name. So we've been doing that. We also make sure that every event, everything we do, we root ourselves in why we're here, why we're doing this work.
Hmm.
So when we have events, we always have a storyteller at the beginning. So I find those storytellers to share their stories so that people can remember why this is so important.
Yeah.
I also, when we have other events, bigger events, we had a rally in DC in, gosh, I think it was November. It feels like a year ago, but we were so close to getting 2297 passed, and we needed to make a very strong statement in DC. And despite, like, I'm still pretty locked down in my house. We go to the doctor. My husband grocery shops once a week. That's all we leave our house for. I felt like my dad gave me marching orders and I had to go for this. So I went to DC with all these amazing people, and we told our stories. We had multiple storytellers, including Rosie Davis from Yellow Heart Memorial. She came in from Texas, and we shared our stories. We had two long haulers, and we demanded that Congress step up. We have a bill, it's bipartisan. It is the most historic global health bill of our lifetime. That there are 5 million policy failures, more even now since that event.
Hmm.
That, in the US, there was almost at that time, now we know the number has surpassed 800,000,
Yeah.
but these are policy failures. And we have the bill. Now get off your tushes and act.
Yep.
And we had, because my father had, told me, bring me to the White House, bring my ashes. But as an Orthodox Jew, we don't cremate. My father wasn't Orthodox, but he wanted a Jewish burial as well. So we could not cremate. And in one of our meetings, I had told a bunch of people, I feel like I'm failing him because I'm not bringing him.
Hmm.
And they're like, no, Sarah, you're bringing him with his story, with everything in you. You're not failing him. But it got us thinking, like, how do we get the attention of Congress? So we put out the word, do you want us to bring your ashes with us?
Oh.
And we got ashes from people.
Wow.
They sent them. I mean, we got ashes all the way from California sent to us. And they asked us to bring their loved ones, and if we needed to, dump them on the stairs of the Senate. And at the end, I was fired up. I was sad. I was mad. And I told the stories of the people who couldn't be with us to tell their stories. And I got fired up and I held up those ashes and I said, let's march to the Senate stairs and let's tell them. And we marched to the Senate stairs, and the rest is history. I don't know how much I can say beyond that because of legal issues. Um, but we marched and we did what we were supposed to do. And we made that statement, and it made Rachel Maddow and some other, you know, articles. And Congress definitely took pause,
Yeah.
and we had bipartisan support. I'm still so mad. We could have passed this bill, but some lawmakers' egos got in the way. And despite a new variant that had just been literally that week
Mhm.
blowing up, the Omicron, and they couldn't get over their egos, and it got left behind.
Mhm.
And I'm mad, but I'm also fired up because we have a Hail Mary, we have another route. There is a an appropriations bill that is coming, and we are working very hard to get the global fund funded, but also to get vaccines around the world. And the reason why we need vaccines globally, and I think a lot of people don't understand this, is that here in our US bubble, we need to vaccinate, absolutely. But other the whole world impacts us.
Mhm.
So by not vaccinating the whole world, variants start forming, and we're seeing it right now. Variants that can get through our defenses of the vaccine. And if we don't vaccinate the world ASAP, this is just going to get worse, not better. And so we are fighting for low and middle income countries that can't afford to get the vaccine, but not only that, they can't administer it. They don't have the supplies. They don't have the special refrigeration stuff. We've got to help them, otherwise, more of us will continue dying from
Yeah.
these variants. And nobody should die this way.
Mhm.
Um, Also, we talk about long haul, and we forget to have the conversation. You can get long haul and develop long haul, even if you're asymptomatic, even
Yeah.
if you have a so called mild case.
Yeah.
And as somebody who has autonomic dysfunction and POTS and long term health impact from a post viral, syndrome
Mhm.
that was triggered by that virus, this is lifelong impact.
Yeah.
And our health system is not just getting overwhelmed with the active cases. It was already overwhelmed before all this.
Mhm.
And so, for me, as somebody with autonomic dysfunction and POTS, it took me 30 years to get diagnosed because doctors didn't know enough about it, because your regular practitioner doesn't know about it, because there's not enough doctors who treat it.
Mhm.
And it was only because another friend of mine happens to have it and tweeted something about it. And I messaged her. I was like, "Who are you saying? Because I have this. I know I have this. I've never been officially diagnosed, but it's kind of acknowledged. And I don't know how to get care." and she gave me her doctor's number. And it is only because of that. And he's one doctor. I live in a major city,
Yeah.
and I still could not get care for this. And so now we're adding millions more people with this
Yeah.
when we didn't have the infrastructure in the first place to treat the people who already had it.
Yeah. And now you have all these long haulers,
Yep.
all of them that are going through this. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah, and so already we weren't getting enough funding for research.
Mhm.
Already we weren't getting, we didn't have doctors who were knowledgeable. And so to add all these people, like I don't want them to go 30 years without a diagnosis. And what like I had doctors who would just tell me my body was wonky.
Oh my. Wow.
So I don't want people to experience this. This is why I'm fighting for this public health job corps. We need more health workers. We need systems in place so that everybody can get treated. And and that's why I'm fighting for that. That's why I am looking forward in 2022 to fight with the long haulers for better care, for funding, for honestly financial help for those who are long haulers because so many of them have become disabled by their long haul.
Yeah.
And most people with autonomic dysfunction and POTS, are not only disabled, but have trouble working day-to-day jobs, have trouble some days I can't get out of bed,
Yeah.
literally. Some days, just my whole body feels like it's on fire and I'm tachycardic and my body's dysfunctioning. And that's what they're experiencing. And I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. So I look forward to getting in the fight with them. I look forward to passing 2297 in some form, even if we have to break it up to get it passed. I I hope that Congress gets a reality check right now. This is dangerous. This is serious. We need to stop calling it mild cases because mild just means you're not in the ICU about to die.
Yeah.
And when I look back at my father's medical record, because it took us 6 months, but we got it finally. They wouldn't give it to us and wouldn't give it to us. When we finally got it, it says that my father was in heart failure when he arrived at the ER.
Oh.
It says in his file that he should not be put in a step down ICU. It says he was getting worse that last day. It says that he never got his special lung treatments because the hospital didn't do them there.
Mm.
And I have to wonder if he got that treatment, if he would be alive today,
Yeah.
because it would have at least helped keep his lungs open. And I know that they were doing the best job that they could, that they were swamped with cases. And I'm mad about that too, quite frankly. I am a Lubavitcher Chassid, which is a type of Hasidus, ultra Orthodox.
Mhm.
A few miles away, as my father was dying of COVID, they had over 500 people at a wedding,
Oh.
unmasked,
Mm.
partying. And to know that my community was doing that as my father took the last ICU bed in the hospital nearest to where they were, that makes me mad.
Mhm.
And knowing that he probably was put into the step down ICU because we refused to vent him,
Mhm.
and they needed that bed for somebody who would be vented. I hope that person survived.
Yeah. Yeah, you feel like the hospital just sort of gave up on him
Yeah,
near the beginning of when he got in the hospital.
yeah. I from what I've read, the pulmonologist never saw him in person.
Oh.
She did telehealth with him from her office down the hall, and I understand they didn't wanna risk her, but she never actually physically checked on him. There is no mention except at the very beginning of the record that he gets these, we don't give them here. Oh, well, he would be better at home getting them, it
Wow.
says somewhere in the record, but she mentions every time she had an appointment with him that he was delirious, that he could not hold a conversation because both it was hard for him to breathe, but also because his mind wasn't all there.
Mhm.
And that really upsets me because none of this was being told to us.
Yeah.
It says in the record that he was COVID positive in the ER. They didn't tell us till Friday. He went in, middle of the night between Tuesday, Wednesday. They finally told us Friday he had COVID. They were telling him that it was probably the Churg Strauss, but they knew it was COVID.
Yeah.
They closed his My Chart within a day so that we had no access to those records
Uh,
until we finally got them. So that worries me too as our hospitals get full again.
mhm.
It worries me as somebody who is very medically complex. What if something happens to me?
Mhm.
It scares me because a couple weeks ago, we were at the hospital with my daughter getting an NG tube because of her autonomic dysfunction and her GI system malfunctioning. And, you know, what happens when they're full?
Yeah.
And I have a friend who also has POTS who was having a heart issue because POTS impacts your heart. She's local and she sat for hours waiting to get into the ER. I have friends who have had to go get tested recently, and if they didn't have COVID already, waiting for that test
Yeah.
probably just exposed them.
Yeah.
Our government is not working for us. They have just accepted that people are going to die or have long-term health impacts.
Yeah.
And I am going to be that voice in their ear,
Mhm. Oh, yeah.
reminding them, no, that these are policy failures, that these people did not have to die. We have to fight harder. And that is what I'm doing at Right to Health. I'm fighting harder and more efficiently by
Yeah.
by being organized, by having these member of Congress meetings and bringing storytellers.
Mhm.
So every meeting I have, I want to have at least 5 storytellers with me to tell their stories so that we can ground these staffers and these Congress people in the reality
Yeah.
that this is what we're fighting for. Our loved ones didn't need to die,
Mhm.
and you have the power to stop it.
Mhm. Yeah. I have a couple of questions that I wanna
Mhm.
ask. You mentioned a few times being angry. Is doing all of this work do you feel like it's helping you work through your anger, channel your anger?
Yeah. So my father was always worried that I'd have this anger and just hold on to it and like bubble
Mm.
up.
Mhm.
And I have learned to take that anger and try to affect positive change. It's why I ran for office in 2019. It is why I was part of the ACA fight. It is why I have done all those things. It's why I love bird dogging. It is why I love direct action because I can go and I can leave it all out there on the marble
Yeah.
And they can't ignore me when my story is bouncing off the marble of the halls of Congress.
Yeah.
And for me, it is healing to af make positive change, but it is also incredibly healing to give others their power and their voice.
Mhm.
So helping them tell their story and hopefully helping heal them. We will get legislation passed. I
Yeah.
mean, we have the support of Congress. We just need the right avenue. We, in 2 years, this organization went from not existing
Mhm.
to having regular meetings with Congress monthly, to getting 11 bills written, to doing all this. We will get stuff passed. We're making change. We're changing hearts in Congress. And all of that to me feels like the legacy. My father was active in the civil rights movement. My father was he was an activist in his day.
Mhm.
And all those lessons he taught me, I'm taking them and not only helping make change, but also helping others help make that change. And that for me is incredibly healing. I'm also working on, I'm a cross stitcher, as I mentioned.
Mhm.
Um, and there is a national COVID cross stitch memorial being worked on.
Huh.
Um, so I'm also taking that anger
Yeah.
and every stitch.
Yep.
It feels so good to poke something. And I was really grateful. They sent me the panel for my father's date of death. And in red, there's a box that is representative. Each step represents somebody who passed that day. And then in blue, every stitch represents somebody diagnosed with COVID that day.
Wow.
My panel for December 2nd is literally almost as long as me.
Wow.
And as I stitch every day, and I stitch while we're in our R2H, our right to health meetings. I stitch when I'm in member of Congress meetings. I stitch because I need something to do with my hands. I stitch when I tell my dad's story. I stitch when I'm teaching others to tell their stories. I stitch when I just need downtime.
Yeah.
And it's this release. And it's going to take me over a year to do this,
Yeah. Wow.
but every stitch is a little closer to healing. Every stitch is a little close to making policy change. So, my work with Right to Health, my work on this COVID cross stitch memorial, that for me is a place to take that anger and turn it into something beautiful, something that makes lasting change for our future. My father always talked about wanting to change the world for better for his future generations. And that's what I'm doing. I'm taking that legacy that he gave me, the skills he taught me, the things my father was a storyteller. He used his art to storytell. And I'm stitching his art into my panel. So I've taken pictures of his art and I've turned them into cross stitch patterns. I'm taking those lessons of how to tell a story from him and how impactful story is to connect humans to humans. So I'm taking all of this, his desire for a better world for not just his generation, future generations, but for all future generations to heart. And that's where I'm channeling this anger to get it done. It fuels that fire under me
Mhm.
to keep working. So when we don't get our legislation passed and we are sad and we mourn that, I still have that fire under my tush,
Yeah.
lighting the way to get this done and won't let me give up until it is. And knowing that I finished that promise to my dad
Yeah.
that I will make sure nobody else is impacted and traumatized by not just COVID, but by future pandemics as well.
Yeah. That's wonderful.
Thank you.
I have a couple more
Yeah.
questions. Um, how did you do anything special on the 1 year anniversary of your dad's passing? How was that for you and your family?
So it was complicated as all heck.
Mhm.
Um, First of all, we have the Jewish calendar, which is a lunar calendar, and is slightly different than the secular calendar.
Okay.
So we actually had 2 dates this year because the calendars don't line up exactly.
Hmm.
So for me, the Jewish date, it was literally right after our action in DC.
Oh, yeah, because that was at the end of November. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was intense.
Mhm.
And I definitely felt my father on my shoulder and channeled that. But my daughter actually was in the hospital on the Jewish date, needing a feeding tube, and because of her autonomic dysfunction. And so being in the hospital on that day, seeing my daughter deal with what she was dealing with was very intense.
Mhm.
It also made gathering even within my own household impossible because I was at the hospital. So I tried to, we were in, it was like 3 weeks of just intense trying to get Congress to get this done.
Mhm.
So I channeled that and I spent my day while, she was resting and whatnot, really putting it all out there and sending letters, making phone calls to Congress people, and really talking to their staffers and telling my dad's story, so that I could do something in his memory that day. The secular date, December 2nd, happened to fall on the fifth night of Hanukkah. So my sister and her daughter, my mom, and my family got on Zoom. My sister that morning got a tattoo for my dad, with his handwriting and a yellow heart, which I had wanted to do with her. Even though she's in Chicago and me here, I wanted to do it at the same time, but unfortunately, my allergist said that I would have an anaphylactic reaction to the ink. So I could not, but we watched her and we celebrated with her, and it's a beautiful memory.
Mhm.
Um, and so we were on that, and then that night I had sent Hanukkah present to Chicago for my niece. Didn't get there in time. Their presents didn't get here in time, but
Mhm.
it's okay. We lit candles. We hung out for a little while. The kids got silly together, and we just kind of were a family that night. And I made my dad's ratatouille. Uh, so we had some of that. And we just told stories and talked about him a little. We were given a really beautiful gift that our speech therapist, because my kids struggle with expressive language, she did a session with them right like the day after he died because I knew that they needed help expressing themselves.
Mhm.
And she recorded memories that they had of him.
Oh.
So I read those, and we talked about him, and we looked at pictures, and we just kind of tried to, it was Hanukkah, so it was complex.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dad, always making it more complex. So we tried to make it a celebration more than sadness,
Mhm. Yeah.
and I hope we succeeded. But every day for me, I'm doing something to memorialize him.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds like it.
So, for me, it was like that 1-year mark was very complex in my head, but I just channeled it into the things I was already doing to heal.
Yeah. Yeah, you have all the lead in, like, all of the events that happen leading up to the day, so
Yeah,
it does feel really complex. The last thing I
yeah.
wanna ask you, and I really wanna hear your answer on this, what do you say to people who tell you COVID isn't real?
I share stories with them. I tell them about all the people I've talked to, all the people who have shared their stories with me, and I tell them about the people who were murdered by COVID,
Mhm.
and about their lives, and about the people they impacted in their lives. I tell them about all these amazing people we have lost in this world. I tell them about the long haulers and the impacts because I personally know what these health impacts feel like. And I share that with them. And then I tell them about what we could do to stop it. I just got I was very excited. I just got Right to Health merch. And I've been wearing my shirts. And they have, sayings, policy failure, that we could have stopped this, that we need to share global vaccines, vaccines globally. And it starts a conversation. So I start the conversation with telling them about all the people who were lost, all the people who are impacted. And then I tell them about what we could do to stop it from continuing to happen. And I humanize it because story, since all the way back to the beginning,
Mhm.
story has been a way for humans to find common ground and share our humanity. So by telling our stories specifically, it humanizes the numbers and it makes people have to pause
Yeah.
and think. So I just emphasize, share your stories. Come on this podcast, share your
Yeah.
stories. Share your stories with Congress people, with Right to Health. Share your stories with other groups that are sharing their stories and fighting for this.
Mhm.
And don't let them silence you. We just have to keep telling those stories. And hopefully, their humanity will come back to them by
Mhm.
hearing these stories.
Yeah. Thank you, Sarah, so much for today. I really, really appreciate you coming on and sharing so much about your dad's story and your family and just everything. It was just beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
And that's the show, everyone. If you've lost a loved one to COVID and would like to share your story on the show, please send me an email. My email address is forthosewelostpodcast@gmail.com. If you like this episode, please share the show. Share it with your friends, share it on your social media, and once you've done that, rate and review this podcast on your favorite listening platform. And then go rate it on Apple Podcast, because that's where most of our new listeners come from. Ratings and reviews are the main way this podcast finds new listeners. So please share the show. Until next time.